My name's Boulevard. I'm a caster and a master rank player, but I've also done balance work for 2 launched card games in the past, so I really like looking at design philosophy for this kind of stuff, and with the first balance change or Rising Tides around the corner, I figured I'd go ahead and move this from the Twitter thread that I usually put it into a video format, just so I can kind of document my thoughts, get it out to a wider audience. It's worth noting that I don't have access to Riot's internal data, which is how they're actually going to be deciding what needs a nerf, so I'm going to mostly be going based off of tournament results and some things that I've seen on the ladder, some personal anecdotes, stuff of that nature. Since the TCGs that I worked on in the past were paper, tournament results were our main driving factor, as well as forums and things of that nature. And it's also worth noting that it is impossible for me to get this 100% right. There's a lot of minor nerfs and buffs that Riot usually throws out there. I'm going to be focusing on the heavy hitters and just kind of seeing if I can identify the key problems in the format and how I would fix them. Grizzled Ranger was easily one of the best cards to come out of Rising Tides. I don't think the card is going to get touched directly on this side. I think that Loyal Badger Bear is where the nerfs are going to be focused, especially since Loyal Badger Bear itself has become a bit of an issue with the Demacia decks, and it's not often that we see the two separated. It's really just standalone decks that run Ranger won't run Badger Bear, but I definitely think that the nerfs are going to be focused on the Badger Bear portion of this card. So I think there's 2 directions you can go with the Badger Bear. The first is turning him into a 5/2, which is a much more aggressive approach if you do want to all in on this like scout aggro plan that the Grizzled Ranger Badger Bear package provides. I don't think he'll see as much play in the Demacia decks. I think he'll still be a very aggressive tool for the Grizzled Ranger. And if you think this is a little bit too overstated, we actually see a vanilla 5/2 in standard already 4/3, and it sees absolutely 0 play. Personally, I like the 3/4 stat line better, and I think it's the one that they're going to go with. I really like the wall identity that Loyal Badger Bear has curated for itself, which is why we see it pop up in things like Lux Karma. Its ability to hold out the early board is impressive, and I think that's kind of what they were going for with this card, but it's currently overperforming due to its versatility, which is generally not something you say about a vanilla unit. Funny enough, on paper, Loyal Badger Bear doesn't look great, so I can kind of see how it slipped through the cracks from the design team, and I'm going to throw 2 terms at you, down trading and up trading. When balancing a stat line, you want to look at how many things of a lower cost can I kill before I die, down trading, and can I one-shot things that cost more than me, up trading. For a vanilla, you would like it to be able to down trade twice or up trade onto something that costs 2 more. The lines on how much something should be able to up trade or down trade become a lot less relevant the higher in cost something goes, but for a 3-drop, I think it's a really reasonable metric to hone in on. So Loyal Badger Bear can usually down trade twice, and for the most part can't up trade onto 5-drops, but Grizzled Ranger up trades impossibly well. And normally I'd want to draw a comparison between Grizzled Ranger and Cursed Keeper since they have the same last breath, but the truth is the cards play very heavily into their regional identity. In Shadow Isle, you want a cheap unit with a strong last breath and you don't care about the downside because you're going to kill it yourself, and the 4/4 acts as a large early tempo swing, so the reduced cost on Cursed Keeper is very relevant. In Demacia, you're a very combat-oriented region. You have a lot of tools to buff up the Badger Bear like Bannerman and War Chef, and most importantly, Cursed Keeper isn't a threat on its own. It represents 1 damage a turn if uncontested, while for 2 more mana, Grizzled Ranger represents 8 damage. I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility for Grizzled Ranger to be stripped of the scout keyword, but I would imagine first they're going to take a crack at Badger Bear and see how that settles. So back to Demacia's identity. Because cards don't exist in a vacuum, you have to balance Loyal Badger Bear around how easily and consistently you can buff him up. Currently, with a single +1/+1 buff, Badger Bear has a stat line of a 5-drop, which is a big jump. With either of these proposed stat lines, a +1/+1 puts him either in line with Basilisk Rider without the Overwhelm, or Bull Elnook without the type advantage. But since he costs 1 less, I think this is pretty fair, especially given the region that he finds himself in. Especially given the nature of temporary buffs like War Chef and Cythria acting as pseudo-healing, it's very common for Badger Bear to downtrade 3 or more times. And I'm fine focusing in on his ability to downtrade as long as he sacrifices some of his uptrade potential, especially since any amount of downtrading you do does affect your ability to uptrade. Earlier I said you want to balance around downtrading twice or uptrading onto something that costs 2 more, and currently with a Bannerman, Badger Bear is able to downtrade twice and then uptrade onto a 5-drop. Nerfing his attack impacts his ability to free trade onto things like Laurent Protege, Wording Stone, Maokai, Scarthane Steph, and things like that. 4 health is supposed to be the safe from removal health total, and you don't want to nerf everything that can touch that or you create a new problem, but I don't think Badger Bear is currently playing stat police like that. I actually had 3 proposed changes to Cythria, like 3 different potential cards that she could become, and the more I storyboarded and had to commit my ideas to video, the less the other 2 made sense, so this is the one that I think actually just makes the most sense. When Vanguard Bannerman got nerfed, it became pretty apparent that Cythria was going to be the next major problem of the deck, with 2 Cythria being nearly impossible to deal with. The buff going out on attack instead of on summon doesn't create as much of a counterplay difference as you'd like, especially given that temporary buffs can act as healing for units. I think Cytherea is a really cool and unique card that you don't want to change the identity of too much, which is like rallying the units behind her and inspiring fear into the enemy. So I think Fearsome is probably the most appropriate and balanced keyword you could choose to give everything else. If you've ever heard the phrase color pie before, then seeing her give Fearsome probably sets off some red flags, but I do think it's cool when one or two cards grab at off-region mechanics, and I think it's both more flavorful and more rewarding for her to give Fearsome than a Demacia-centric keyword like Tough or Challenger. Challenger would be really weird from a gameplay standpoint since you'd have to give it before you actually lock in the attacks, which is unintuitive to how the game works, and Tough is a bit redundant since she already +1/+1s the board. She's a great finisher for sure, and I think that's the identity that we want to hone in on, which is why I don't like Tough as a replacement keyword, and instead we want to tone back the power of her as a tempo swing. Giving the +1 in Fearsome already makes it so that your guys can't get chump blocked, so the 1 health is to go for more effective trading, which I think is where some of the problems come from. Strictly as a finisher, you don't care about the health of your units in terms of trading. Dodging removal for your final push is important, but we usually see multiple Cytherea swings thrown out before the game ends. And if you keep choking out stat advantages with her swings, you can grind out your opponent very quickly, and I think her being able to push damage just as her identity is fine. The Fearsome still prevents chump blocks onto your damaged units, so you still get to effectively trade, and I'm honestly not sure that the reduction of her own health is necessary. That might be all-inning a bit too much on the identity of the nerf, but I think taking the health off of the attack buff in conjunction with a Badger Bear nerf should be enough to bring Bannerman more in line with other decks. It's important to remember that when you're balancing cards, the goal is balance, not the complete destruction of an archetype or playstyle. If you've watched any of my tournament content or looked at tournament results on your own, you'll know that Unyielding Spirit is a big-time player in the tournament landscape. It's been played in every kind of Demacia deck so far, and has been holding over a 50% play rate in Bannerman decks, at least from the tournaments I've been able to gather data from. There's major potential for Riot's data to say otherwise on this one. And I like the card, I think it's really cool, and I currently think it's coming down too early. In Bannerman decks, we don't usually see it played on curve like we would in a standalone deck, but being able to curve out the first 3 turns, take off turn 4, and then make a champion like Fiora unkillable is a little early for the game to be more or less over. It's certainly not an auto-win card, there's a lot more play around for it than you might expect on paper, but I do think its win rate when played on curve is likely a lot higher than is healthy. Delaying it for a turn I think is pretty reasonable, and also impacts its late game potential since you would no longer be able to play it in the same turn as Karma or Garen. I think it's pretty commonly agreed upon that Boom Crew Rookie is the biggest offender in the burn deck, and I think the most likely change is going to be onto his attack, health, or cost. Cost seems the most likely to me since there are so many 2-drops in the burn deck already, and I think making the curve out of rookies and preventing the early game flood is what they're going to attack, and honestly I would be pretty bummed if they did decide to hit his on attack damage. While I do think it's a bit much for a 2-cost unit with 4 health to push through no matter what, I do like the identity of the card and think it's pretty in line with Piltover and Zon as a whole. I don't want to see Burn gutted, but I do think that the win rate for it is definitely at a point where it needs to get tweaked just a little, especially if everything else is getting nerfed. That being said, I also do want a slight attack reduction on Legion Grenadier. So to me, Burn and Aggro are different. Burn connotates direct damage to the Nexus, and Aggro means pushing through damage with units. Currently, I think the only units in the Burn deck that don't offer any form of direct damage are Legion Rearguard and Precious Pet. With so much unpreventable direct damage, the diversity of the format definitely feels limited, and while I'm not advocating for opening up the floodgates and letting turn 10 Karma decks take over, aggro decks feel like they've been completely overshadowed by Burn. I'd like to see a healthy mix of the two with slightly varying playstyles and matchups, but right now it feels like Burn is just far and away better, and part of that I think is linked to Legion Grenadier. While Boom Crew averages 4 to 6 Nexus damage because he's resilient, if Grenadier gets off 1 attack, he represents 5 damage, which is a lot for a 2-drop, and he makes it nearly impossible to hold the board versus Burn. And it's possible that that's what Burn needs to be a meta mainstay. I could just be totally off the mark with this nerf, but I do think something other than Boom Crew also needs a tweak, and given Riot's history of nerfing pretty aggressively, I don't think it'd be totally out of the blue. And I think that if you're going to nerf anything, I'd much rather it be the units than the spells since they're less versatile. And with so many Burn spells out in the game now, I think that Burn archetype has power crept and we need to tone back the units just a little bit. I had mentioned in my last Tournament Tactician video that it seems Shadow Isle's identity was slipping toward becoming the Atrocity region. We've seen it played in Sea Monsters and Karina, and of course it's in Endure Spiders. I thought about a nerf to up Endure to 7 mana because sometimes they who Endures played on curve can take over a game, but I don't want to nerf both Atrocity and Endure. I think literally the only way to nerf either one would be the cost, and if you nerf both, then you can never play them in the same turn, which I really don't like. A 20/20 Endure doesn't cost 6 mana, it costs 6 mana and 19 units. And yes, you built your deck like that, but you still put all this effort into stalling out so that you can play your massive abomination and one-shot your opponent, and that needs to feel rewarding. Atrocity is sort of the oh shit button for vulnerable strategies, and I do like that as the card's identity. I still very much want you to be able to play this in the same turn as Endure, but I also want you to have to play for it, and requiring you to bank 3 spell mana does mean that the combo can't happen until turn 10, and that you have to consciously bank the maximum amount of mana to make it happen. Deep and Karina don't really feel a cost increase on this card too much, because they don't always play it anyway, so you can't exactly take aim at either one of them specifically, but it does hurt Deep because it can't be played in the same turn as Nautilus, which I think is fine because Nautilus generates his own value by reshuffling sea monsters into your deck and reducing their cost, while Endure is just big. Vi Heimerdinger and Karina Control and Vi Bannerman on ladder all have pretty high win rates and a common factor. Vi has broken onto the scene as one of, if not the best Rising Tides champion, springboarding Piltover and Zon into one of the best regions in the game. While her main purpose has been to power up already existing archetypes, I think she's added just a little bit too much power. That was a clip from Duels of Runeterra 9 where Christmas Time got a 4-for-1 with his Vi, which is too common of a scenario. Reducing her health is a pretty boring change overall, and I do think keeping upgraded Vi as a 10-6 is honestly fine, but her front side is getting too much done currently. Prior to the release of Rising Tides, Riot had put Karma and Ezreal on their watch list. I think when making balance changes, it's important to speculate about what your new format is going to look like if you can, and make some adjustments for that as well. While you don't want to nerf everything to the point your game is no longer fun, it's important to strive for balance in a format rather than a pile of band-aids. Ezreal fell off after the release of Rising Tides as the format became more aggressive, but he's still seeing a fair amount of play. And given that he was watchlisted before the set dropped, and if you're nerfing the archetypes that power crept him, it doesn't seem like a stretch to say Ezreal could take over the format again. I know when it was a spotlight discussion, most people wanted to see Ezreal reduced to 1 damage per spell, and I think this or upping the amount of targets needed are the only realistic ways to keep his identity intact. I was leveling a European account this week, and in the Ezreal tutorial, this is how Ezreal functioned. In the tutorial, he still dealt 2 damage per spell, which is obviously insanely broken, but if you nerf him to 1 damage per spell, you have to give him something else or the archetype will likely cease to exist. If you can't read the changes or can't spot them, the number of targets needed to level him was reduced to 6 from 8, and upgraded Ezreal's fleeting Mystic Shot cost 0 mana. Reducing the number of targets necessary and making upgraded Ezreal create a 0 mana Mystic Shot ties more power into the elusive 4 health unit, pulling his own weight, and makes him a lot more splashable as a value champion rather than a combo one. It admittedly does feel like it limits the playability of the combo version of the deck, relying on either Karma to bring back 2 damage Ezreal, or additional burn from Noxus to close out games, but I'm not convinced that it kills the archetype. This is probably the hottest take in the video, so if you don't agree with me, I totally understand. Combo is a hard thing to balance, and it's probably the thing I've gotten into the most arguments with other designers about, and I don't want to kill Ezreal combo, but I don't mind it falling more in line with a traditional combo than a setup into a 1-card checkmate. That's all I had in terms of things that I think are getting hit, but Sea Monsters and Frostbite decks came up really big in last week's Duels of Runeterra. I'm not sure exactly what the ladder data says, but if those archetypes are strong enough on ladder to warrant a balance change, I think this is what they would look like. Again, I do not think Nautilus is getting nerfed, but if you do nerf Sea Monsters, I think this is what would happen. I think Jaw Hunters would also be the other fair hit as it bridges the gap between early and late game value very well, but I'm not actually sure how I would nerf that one, and since I don't think it's happening, I didn't put that much thought into it. Much like the Nautilus change, I don't think Frostbite decks are getting nerfed, but if the data shows that the win rate is too high, I think this is how I would do it. We saw a wide variety of Freljord decks during Duels of Runeterra 9, and Ashe does seem to keep randomly popping up into playability every couple of weeks. Frostbite effects in general are pretty strong, and the drawback is that the spells that do it are -1s, so most of the power tied into Frostbite are the units themselves. It's possible that this would be too big of a hit, as it does take away a fair amount of defensive capabilities and limit the range of the deck, but you're nerfing it. And I don't think the stats of Icevale Archer matter as much as the ability. So this is how I would nerf it if Frostbite effects had to get nerfed somehow, but once again, I do not think that is happening. Back in the patch when Troop of Elnix got nerfed from the top 10 down to the top 6, I think there were actually a lot of interesting community ideas going around about how to balance this card, and I would like to see it come back into viability in some way because I have not seen a single copy of this card since the nerf, and I do think it was a pretty interesting design space. Please remove the Elite tag from Border Lookout. Battlesmith Demacia is no longer a deck, no one plays it. It is no longer a buff to Border Lookout. It is just a nerf to Swiftwing Lancer. Please buff Swiftwing Lancer by getting rid of the elite tag from Border Lookout. I don't have an outro card, so this is me telling you that it's the end of the video. My name is Boulevard. Thanks for watching.